Hi everybody. This video is just going to talk a little bit about philosophical argumentation. We're going to use these tools throughout the semester to analyze our own arguments that we're going to be creating as well as the arguments of others. So we're going to get our basic terminology down here. I'm going to talk about some of the informal fallacies that you have in the handout that's available on Moodle. And we'll also talk very briefly about the online poll that I had you do on Moodle where you're evaluating 3 different arguments pertaining to the death penalty. A lot of the material that you'll see here today, we're going to apply to the material for the next class session, which is an examination of the Platonic dialogue Crito. So keep all this stuff in mind and we'll use it to build up our analysis of that dialogue. So I'm going to go to a PowerPoint now. So we're just going to talk a little bit about what we mean in philosophy when we talk about philosophical argumentation, what we don't mean, some things you should definitely try to do, and some other things you might want to avoid. So when we think about an argument, in normal terminology, we mean people getting angry, fighting with each other, yelling at each other. There's definitely an attempt to win, but you want to do that in this type of argument by being loud and forceful, basically strong-arming your opponent. That's not what we're doing in philosophical argumentation, though. So in philosophy, when we talk about creating an argument to support our point of view, we're not talking about doing whatever it takes to win. We're talking about putting forth a reasoned position supported by what we call premises or reasons that support that conclusion for our position. So in philosophical argumentation, we have a conclusion. And the reason why I have the conclusion stated first here is that even though if you were writing a paper or something like that, you might put the conclusion section at the end. In philosophy, you want to state your conclusion, otherwise sometimes known as a thesis statement, right up front so that the listener knows exactly what it is you're trying to convince them of, or the reader knows exactly what it is you're trying to make a case for. So our conclusion, as I said, is just our basic thesis statement. It's the position that you're trying to support. You're going to support those conclusions with premises. Premises are just reasons that lead the reader or the listener to support and agree with the conclusion that you're trying to represent. So here we have a nice example here. Socrates is mortal. That's our conclusion. And that's supported with 2 premises. Socrates is human and all humans are mortal. So this is a great example of a nice, simple, logically sound argument. We're going to evaluate premises in a philosophical argument based on 2 criteria. We want all of our premises to be both true and relevant to the conclusion that we're trying to support. So it's clearly important why our premises need to be true. We don't want to make up facts out of thin air, or we don't want to say things as if they were true that haven't in fact been shown to be true. Not all premises are going to be fact statements, so sometimes we're going to be presenting premises, or we're going to be looking at premises that you would have to argue for the truth of, that you would have to show why they're true. But for the most part, we want premises that can be shown to be true. And then relevant premises are just premises that don't go off on a tangent, that are directly related to the case that you're trying to make and that support your conclusion. So some of the informal fallacies that we'll talk about in a few minutes are making the mistake of being irrelevant, of taking the argument away from presenting premises that support the conclusion. So what I asked you to do on Moodle is to participate in a poll that asks which argument out of 3 possible choices is the best one. So if you haven't done that already, you need to go complete that activity and then come back here. We're going to talk about those 3 arguments. And I'll talk about which one that I intended to be chosen as the best, although you may have different reasons why you may possibly have chosen a different argument. So the first choice, paragraph A, or argument number 1, is arguing for the conclusion that the death penalty is wrong. This is the same conclusion that the other 2 arguments are also supporting. So we know that the difference is not going to be found in the conclusion, but in the way that that's argued for. This author's premises are listed here. It's not harsh enough. More suffering would be achieved in the worst prisons. It's an easy escape, and we need to get good payback through lifelong suffering, life in prison. So we have some pretty strong premises here. They are directly relevant to the conclusion. There are some that we might want to evaluate on how true they are. We don't know, just based on the information that's presented to us here, whether all of these are true. We also may see some informal fallacies at work here that I'll talk about in a few minutes, but specifically the idea of appeal to emotion, if we're talking about things like suffering and payback and harshness, those are all emotional appeals that would allow us the punishers to feel more satisfied with the punishment that we're giving out. So this argument has some strengths and some weaknesses to it. Hopefully you thought it was stronger than the second argument, which seems very repetitive. So a lot of people get really frustrated with this one. We see the word wrong occurring in 3 out of the 4 premises in addition to in the conclusion. So this argument really isn't saying very much, right? We know that this person thinks that killing is wrong and the death penalty is wrong because it's killing people. There are also some informal fallacies at work here. Everyone has been taught that killing is wrong. That's something that's known as appeal to majority opinion, or the bandwagon fallacy, and that just means that something must be true because everyone thinks it or everyone supports it. That statement, that third premise there, is also of dubious truth, right? We don't know for sure whether everyone has actually been taught that in their lives. So this is probably the weakest of the 3 arguments. And then finally, the third choice is a little more concise, right? We only have 3 premises leading us to the same conclusion, that the death penalty is wrong, based on the assertion that it doesn't deter people since they think they won't get caught. It sends a contradictory message, and there's a risk that an innocent person might be executed. So these are all very relevant to the conclusion. We don't know whether they're all true, right? Again, the first premise there is something that we would have to show to be true if we were really creating a complete argument here. But this is probably the strongest of the 3 arguments in that it's the most direct, and we know that all 3 of these premises, if they were true, would clearly support the conclusion. There are no fallacies present here, unlike in the other 2 arguments. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these informal fallacies. So you have a handout on these. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail in this video. I just want to talk about the main ones, hit the highlights, and talk about some ways in which they deviate from the goal of philosophical argumentation. So informal fallacies are called this because they're fallacies that aren't based on the form or the structure of the argument itself, but they're not logical fallacies that create a logical contradiction. Rather, they're fallacies that just deviate from the proper way of arguing. So the main way that they do this is by avoiding presenting good premises to support their conclusion. They present things that are irrelevant in order to distract the listener or the reader instead of supporting the person's point of view. Sometimes informal fallacies, if you're trying to rebut another person's argument, avoid addressing the content of that other person's argument. So these are the 2 most common ways in which an informal fallacy is in fact incorrect. Sometimes they'll also present premises that are either not true or not relevant. So in terms of avoiding providing premises, we've got 6 in that list that you have in the handout that do this: appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, appeal to majority, ignorance, circular argument, and begging the question. So when we're talking about appeal to authority, advertisements are a great way to do this. Every time you see a celebrity endorsement or professional endorsement of a product, this authority figure says this is good, therefore it must be good. That's the assumption there. Appeal to emotion is another one, where the argument is that this will make you feel good or feel bad, or you should do this because won't someone please think of the children or the animals, right? Here's a great example of that again. A lot of these are very popular to use in advertising. Be a hero for animals. Here's a poor little kitten that we want to help and save, and we want to feel good about ourselves by being a hero. Appeal to the majority is another one. If everyone thinks so, it must be true. 50 million Elvis fans can't be wrong. I don't have an image for appeal to ignorance, but that's just an argument that says if you can't prove me wrong, then I must be correct. And you have some examples of that in the handout. Bigfoot must exist because nobody's proved that Bigfoot doesn't exist. The last 2, circular argument and begging the question, are kind of similar. In a circular argument, it's very similar to the second paragraph in the poll that you just did. The conclusion itself is restated oftentimes as a reason to support that conclusion. So in that case, we had the death penalty is wrong because it's just wrong. Everybody knows it's wrong. Here's another example here. The napkin religion is the one true religion because it says so right here on this napkin. So the source is being used to endorse itself, right? Begging the question is kind of similar. When a person's begging the question, what they're doing is they're asserting something to be true without showing why it's true. So again, to go back to that second of the 3 choices for arguments about the death penalty, begging the question would be saying something along the lines of, we all just know this is wrong, therefore it's wrong, without showing why it's wrong. So we have lots of good examples here of ways in which you could try to shirk your duties as a good arguer by avoiding providing good premises. You can also avoid dealing with other people's premises in the following ways. An ad hominem attack is an attack on the individual instead of on what they're actually saying. So this is something that, again, we see a lot in political debates. Oftentimes, politicians will attack one another on a personal level instead of dealing with that person's policies or programs or proposals. The straw man fallacy is another thing that we often see in political debate, where another person's position is misrepresented to be much more simplistic than it actually is, and that makes it much easier to argue against and shoot down. A false dilemma is another one. This image is not a false dilemma, it's the genetic fallacy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A false dilemma is another one in which I present two options as sort of a black and white choice when there are probably many more choices available. Finally, the genetic fallacy. This is saying that something must be incorrect because of its source, right? So your position is wrong because it comes from this source I don't approve of, or because this figure that I don't like agrees with you. So this little cartoon here, you know, who also liked evolution? Adolf Hitler. If he likes it, then it must not be right or correct. So here you just have a basic overview here. There's one that I want to talk about that doesn't fall into either of these categories, and that's the slippery slope fallacy. So the slippery slope fallacy is tricky because every once in a while the slippery slope might actually turn out to be true. It's something you definitely want to watch out for and be very careful about if you wanted to propose it or if you see it in another person's argument. Basically, the slippery slope fallacy says that if we allow this one thing that seems kind of okay, it's actually going to be very dangerous because we will inevitably also have to accept all these other bad things that are truly terrible. So a great example of this in recent US politics is in the argument on gay marriage, same-sex marriage, in which a senator named Rick Santorum proposed that if we allow same-sex marriage, we would also therefore have to allow other practices that nobody would want to endorse, like adults marrying children and people marrying animals and polygamy and all kinds of other things that we don't want to allow. So that's a great example of a slippery slope argument. If we allow this one thing that's being proposed, all these other really bad things are going to follow and chaos will ensue. So it might be true. I can imagine a law that was passed that would allow all of those things without making any distinctions. But it's not inevitable. So in the case of gay marriage, for example, I can imagine a law being passed that endorses same-sex marriage but still limits the definition of marriage to a relationship between two consenting adult human beings, in which case none of those other bad things would happen. So proposing a slippery slope argument would require you to show that these other bad things that you fear are inevitable and could not be prevented. So what's next? I want you to keep these fallacies in mind and these styles of argumentation in mind when we're reading the Crito, which is what the assigned reading is for next time. What I want you to do specifically, you're going to be reading a dialogue written by Plato, and it's a conversation between Plato's teacher Socrates and another guy named Crito. And Crito is trying to convince Socrates to do something. So I want you to look at Crito's argument and look for any informal fallacies that you see there in his line of reasoning. And we're going to use that to further apply our ideas of how to make a good philosophical argument. That's it, and I'll see you guys next time.